Hello class, good morning. For those who cannot attend the online class due to poor signal, no power yet, or other reasons, you can attend this video lesson which I will upload later on. So our topic for today is the global economy. So let's start with the 8 Millennium Goals. This was made by the UN or United Nations to address the different problems of the world. Their efforts were guided by the 8th Millennium Development Goals, which was created in the 1990s. So the first of these goals is one, the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. So when you say eradication, it means that there will be no more of this thing. So wala na po siya. There is no more extreme poverty and hunger. Achieving universal primary education is the second goal. In other words, when you say universal, it is for everyone throughout the world. So everyone will have to have this thing. And when you say primary education, this is for us in the Philippines, the elementary level. Maybe in other countries, it might be a different education system. But this is the goal for the UN, achieving at least universal primary education for all. Next is promoting gender equality and women empowerment. In other words, there is more equal treatment between men and women. This comes in terms of work, in terms of the salary, etc. etc. Empowering women to have similar or equal rights with men. So in other parts of the country class, oh sorry, not the country, in other parts of the world, some women do not have equal rights with men. Some cannot vote, some cannot drive, some cannot have even education. So this is one of the goals of the UN to eliminate that inequality. Next is reducing child mortality or reducing the rate of children dying. Next is improving maternal health. So in other words, improving the healthcare of pregnant women. So that may have something to do with the maternity leave, the medicine available to pregnant women, the healthcare, etc. etc. Combating diseases like HIV, AIDS, and malaria. So those are some very common diseases in other parts of the world which is not yet fully controlled in some areas. There is what you call this outbreak or epidemic. So this is one of the things that UN is trying to stop. Next is ensuring sustainable environment or environmental sustainability. In other words, we're trying to make sure that the world can still sustain itself for the coming generations. And having global partnership for development. In other words, this is when the many countries in the world come together to help one another in developing the economy. So these are those 8 Millennium Development Goals as set by the United Nations. Let's talk a bit more about poverty. This is actually the most important one that the United Nations is tackling because once they have tackled poverty, those other issues or problems would be easier to solve. So throughout the world, there are many different standards of living. For example, in the Philippines, what might be considered poverty line might actually not be that bad in other countries which are far more poor compared to the Philippines. Same way in the US, for example, what can be considered poor or within poverty in the US may not actually be poverty yet here in the Philippines. In the Philippines, for example, one is living in poverty if he or she makes around 100,534 or less pesos in a year or around 275 pesos per day. This is the family income class. So when you take into account all of the income of the whole family, if that is just what they're making in 1 year, you could consider that as the living in poverty. You can also call this the poverty line or the threshold. So when you are living exactly that amount, you're already living in poverty. When you go over that, you are no longer living in poverty. So again, there is differing levels of poverty throughout the world. Now, let's talk about extreme poverty, which is different compared to normal poverty. It is much more extreme. Why? This is because there is a severe deprivation of basic human needs. These needs include food, safe drinking water, sanitation facilities, health, shelter, education, information, or in other words, you are living with only $1.25 or 65 pesos per day. So that is what you call living in extreme poverty. The United Nations aims to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. Currently, there are 136 million people living in extreme poverty, but this is already down from previously stated around 1.9 billion dati yung living in extreme poverty. So what are some reasons why extreme poverty is falling or being reduced? One is better access to education. So when you have better education, you have more opportunities in life, especially when it comes to jobs. Next is humanitarian aid. So there is more aid being received by those poor countries. This aid can come in the form of food. They could create shelters. They could give medicine, or they could even give gadgets to help in education. There are also policies of international organizations. There could be policies where they would be more helpful to those countries which are experiencing difficulty. They could have donations, they could give more in terms of trade, they could make the trade easier for them. The greatest factor, however, is economic globalization. Or, in other words, when more economies are interconnected, they can help each other. Free trade has driven the growth of developing economies. So, because of free trade, almost all economies in the world have grown to some degree or to some extent. So, let's talk about economic globalization and global trade. This is referring to increasing interdependence of world economies. This is the result of growing scale of cross-border trade of commodities and services. So in other words, all throughout the world, most countries are already exchanging goods and services far more easily than before. That's why they're becoming more interdependent and interconnected with one another. As well as the flow of international capital and wide and rapid spread of technology. So not just the goods and services, but also capital, foreign investment, even technology class. They are already spreading throughout the world. And once this is spread, this improves the lives of many people. Continuing expansion and mutual integration of market frontiers is a reversible trend for economic development. In other words, once you've already started becoming more dependent with other countries, this is oftentimes an irreversible trend for that country. So let's talk about protectionism, which is one of the two forms of economies in the world. Economies in the world. Those are the two economies associated with economic globalization. One is protectionism. This is a policy of systematic government intervention in foreign trade with the objective of encouraging domestic production. So in other words, when you say protectionism, what you are trying to improve or stimulate here is your own domestic production, or those brands, those companies which are located in your own home country. This gives preferential treatment to domestic producers and discriminates against foreign competitors. So in other words, those foreign countries, they oftentimes do not get the same equal treatment, or they have a harder time selling their products in other countries. There are two forms of protection. Generally, first, of course, is the quota which sets a number or a limit for a quantity of good coming to a country. So let's say for the iPhone, which is a foreign product coming from USA, from Apple, you could say that we have a quota of maybe 1 million Apple iPhones for just 1 year. That is their quota. They can no longer go past that quota. There's also tariffs, which are taxes or duties placed on imports and exports. So in other words, let's say for example, if in the US the price of the iPhone is around $999, so more or less that's around 50k pesos, maybe there's additional tax which would be added on top. So if that comes to the Philippines, it would be we would be less encouraged to get those products. So let's say for example, the Apple iPhone is around 1,000 pesos there. Maybe here in the Philippines, the amount is around maybe let's say $1,100 or maybe around 55k peso. So that's the difference. Both started during the age of mercantilism when other countries started trading more with one another. This is between the 16th to 17th century until the early years of the Industrial Revolution. And this peaked during the Great Depression, which was a time after World War I where the countries experienced a great recession. When you see recession class, the economy is getting smaller and more people would lose their jobs. So a recession is something we're currently experiencing now due to the COVID pandemic. So there are a lot of people losing their jobs, some businesses are closing. Overall, there is a economic slump that is occurring. Some countries class which are accused of protectionism until today includes China, USA, and Japan. So those countries have many domestic producers or domestic, you need to call this domestic, like international organizations, which is based in their country. Let's say, for example, USA, do you have Ford, General Motors, or those other US brands? You could say McDonald's. Maybe the US government is protecting those companies by giving them special subsidies, helping them. So the opposite of protectionism is trade liberalization. When you say liberalization, it's like free trade. You're freeing the trade. So this started more or less after World War II and is influencing the shift from protectionism to trade liberalization. Remember class, after World War II, more and more countries started working together. Free trade agreements and technological advances in both technology and communication allowed for goods and services to move around the world more easily than ever. One of these technologies is the mobile phone. It is said to be the single most transformative technology. It gives people access to banking, payment system. So in the Philippines, you can already start iBanking or internet banking, payment system like Paymaya or GCash. We also have better access to education and information. So you can use your mobile phone not only for mobile games like Mobile Legends class, you can also use it for research. Okay? There is some places where farmers can be able to get the prices for crops via mobile phones. So some farmers class, they can no longer go to the city. They would just rely on their mobile phones to know what is the price of their product or the proper price of their crops. Again, it is more affordable to build cell towers than thousands of kilometers of telephone lines. So it is more affordable to do that. This process where countries skip to the more efficient and cost-effective technology is called leapfrogging. So when you say leapfrogging, it's like, let's say, a very poor country before, they have no telecommunications. Instead of building those thousands of kilometers of telephone lines, they jump straight into building cell towers, which is more efficient and more cost-effective. So that is called leapfrogging. You're going to a more efficient and cost-effective technology. And finally, let's talk a little bit about fair trade, which should not be confused with free trade or trade liberalization. Fair trade, as defined by the International Fair Trade Association, is the concern for social, economic, and environmental well being of marginalized small producers. This aims for a more moral and equitable global economic system. So, in other words, class, it helps those small businesses which are oftentimes being hurt by those large corporations, large companies. So, what are some of the aims of fair trade? One is protection of workers and producers. So, you have to protect the workers and producers, give them good or a good salary, a good working environment, establishment of more just prices. When you say just prices, you are giving a good opportunity to those small producers to not experience parang lugi, hindi sila nalulugi class. Environmentally sound practices and sustainable production. Oftentimes, class, those small producers have very small impact on the environment because they're just small producers compared to those large producers or large companies or corporations who have very big factories. They spew out a lot of gas, greenhouse gases from their factories. They use a lot of water. They produce a lot of waste. So fair trade aims to help those small businesses or small producers. Relationship between the producers in South and consumers in the North. So again, those in the North, we are not talking about the North Pole or etc. We're talking about the rich countries living inside the Northern Hemisphere. So you have the Northern America, yes, North America. So you have the USA, Canada. You also have the Europe, which is part of the Northern Hemisphere. So European countries. There is a better relationship between them. And when you say producers in the South, we're saying countries who are primarily producers of raw materials. We are trying to give them better quality of life and better opportunities. And last is again promoting safe working environment for all workers. So that is the end of the lesson. Thank you for attending and stay tuned for the next lesson next week. Thank you.